Hello and welcome to Orange Genie's webinar on the Autumn Budget 2018. My name is Helen Christopher. I'm the Operations Director for Orange Genie Accountancy, and I'm joined by Damon Cochrane, Operations Director for Orange Genie Umbrella. We've run these webinars for both agencies and contractors over the last couple of years, trying to let interested parties know the key changes in the legislation as we see them. And I'm glad to say they've always received positive feedback, so hopefully today's webinar will be no less informative. I'll run through the details as we've interpreted them since yesterday's budget, and there'll be a chance at the end for some questions. Orange Genie Group are an accredited member of the Freelancer Contractor Services Association, the FCSA. Our CEO, Graham Fisher, is a former chairman of FCSA, and he spends much of his time consulting and lobbying with HMRC. So in the past few months, we've seen a continued focus from HMRC and the industry on compliance, something we've been pushing quite heavily with them. So we were pleased when the Chancellor said yesterday that he wants to see a tax system that's fair and robust against abuse. When news of an early budget broke, along with it came various rumours, obviously. Would the 2000 dividend allowance be scrapped? Would entrepreneurs' relief be removed? Were there going to be changes afoot for the national insurance rules for the self-employed? And the big one, of course, was whether or not the public sector IR35 changes would be rolled out into the private sector. Well, now we know. There's no more crystal ball time. Philip Hammond confirmed yesterday that the IR35 changes for the private sector will come into play from April 2020. This delay in applying the rules allows us much more time for all parties to plan and establish some robust systems, and provides us with an opportunity to learn from the lessons of the public sector, something we'll look at in a few moments. So whilst the government have listened to our concerns over a speedy introduction of the public sector rules into the private sector, they're not backing down on the principles. Despite all the evidence we've put before them and other people in the industry and the experience of the public sector rollout, they're ploughing ahead with the changes, and they believe they will raise them tax revenues in the region of 550 million. Right now, in the aftermath of the speech, emotions are running quite high, and it'd be quite easy for us to sit here with our head in our hands and ponder, how could HMRC have got this so wrong? How can they not have understood the evidence we've all put before them? In reality, the time for pondering is probably over now. Disappointment and anger will dissipate in the coming weeks, and what we need to do is work together with end clients, recruitment agencies and contractors to find a way through the changes. We do know from our experience of working with our agency partners with leading defence, automotive and aerospace end clients that early collaboration and open conversations are providing opportunities for parties to find solutions, so we'll be continuing to encourage that behaviour. The Chancellor confirmed that the rules applied to the public sector from April 2017 will be applied to the private sector from April 2020, as I've already said. But what he didn't give was too much detail as to whether the application would be identical as it is in the public sector. But our assumption at the moment is that it won't be very different, although there is still some chance there will be some changes, as the Treasury have announced a further consultation on the rollout in 2019. What that consultation will look like and what it will consist of, we'll have to wait and see. Assuming for now the rules will be the same as in the public sector, this will mean that if you operate in the private sector from April 2020, you will no longer be responsible for determining your own IR35 status, where your end client is defined as a large or medium-sized company. The responsibility will pass to your ultimate end client, and if you're deemed to be inside IR35, the party paying your invoice or the fee payer will need to deduct appropriate PAYE and NIC payments before making a payment to you. Only end clients meeting the definition of a small company are excluded, and as yet we have no definition of a small company within the context of IR35. At the moment, we think it's fair to assume it won't be far off the usual definition used in company law, where a company will need to meet 2 out of 3 criteria to be classified as small. Those criteria are based on turnover of being less than 6.5 million, a net balance sheet value of less than 3.2 million, and employing less than 50 people. Until we have sight of the legislation, we can't really say how this is set to work. Whilst we do welcome excluding the smallest end clients from these rules in recognition of the difficulties they may have in implementing and managing the changes, there has to be some concern that this approach will lead to confusion for contractors. Each contractor will need to determine every time they start a new contract who's responsible for their IR35 assessment. So what should you do now? I think the best place to start when considering the implications of the changes is probably to look back and review the public sector experience. What did happen after April 2017 when changes were made in the public sector? Many public sector departments took what appeared to be the least risky approach and found all of their contractors to be inside IR35 through blanket decisions. Suddenly, the false self-employment HMRC were wanting to prevent turned on its head, and we've got genuine contractors forced into false employment, suffering employment taxes, but without the benefit of employment rights. The immediate response of contractors was to seek alternative contracts in the private sector, leaving projects under-resourced and little or no experience in some public sector bodies. Blanket decisions aren't allowed by the legislation, and we quickly saw some backtracking in the market. Certain public sector bodies, such as TfL, reviewed their approach to blanket IR35 assessments and began to take reasonable care in the IR35 reviews as the legislation requires them to. In other cases where blanket decisions were not overturned or where resource remained short, some bodies had to pay increased day rates to retain their contractors. Worryingly, one of the consequences of the public sector rollout was, as we predicted, a mass migration of contractors towards the use of offshore loan scheme providers and non-compliant schemes. The spotlight is currently on these schemes, where an advertised 95% take-home pay has blinded people into using such unscrupulous schemes. Unfortunately, these do prey on the vulnerable and those seeking to maximise income. The schemes purport to pay a small salary and to offer the remainder of the earnings through a loan arrangement, where the loan isn't taxable whilst it remains repayable. HMRC have made it quite clear they won't tolerate these arrangements and have been proactively closing down such schemes. We've seen a lot of evidence of this over the last few months. It isn't a defence to say you didn't realise you were entering into such a scheme or arrangement, and HMRC have extended powers to investigate non-deliberate avoidance now for 12 years. If the scheme you are using is caught, the bills for non-paid tax will fall on you, unfortunately, and not the scheme promoter. The introduction of the Criminal Finances Act in 2017 has highlighted the risk of advising contractors to consider these non-compliant schemes. Agencies are aware of their responsibility in the supply chain and the potential for facilitating tax evasion, and many of them are now beginning to carry out the required levels of due diligence to ensure that they and their contractors are not caught by such schemes. It really is a case, if it seems too good to be true, it probably is. The best advice I can give you is to stick to the rules and make sure you use a compliant provider. Your tax paid may seem higher than that offered by some of these alternative schemes, but in the long run, it will be cheaper than the fines and penalties that you could face. So with these lessons from the public sector in mind, what practical steps should you be taking over the coming months to prepare for the potential changes? It's never been more important, in my opinion, to understand your IR35 position. Best practice has always been to assess each of your new contracts, both in terms of the written contract and the working practices. And if you've let this habit slide in the past, now's the time definitely to get back on top of things. It is worth talking to your agency and end clients now. Find out what their process is going to be with regard to deciding your IR35 status. Many of them have been talking about this for a while, and it will be new to them. If you're confident in your contract and your working practices, and that you feel you can clearly demonstrate your status, you may find that you're in a very strong position to help your end client make the determination, and you can be part of that decision-making process. If your end client is a small business, it looks like you're still going to be responsible for the decision, so it's best to be prepared now and understand your IR35 status. As I said, we've worked with many leading end clients through agency partnerships, and many of those are already seeking conversations and collaboration with contractors to make sure mutually agreeable solutions are found. So if you've not already done so, as I said, consider your IR35 status. Ensure you've reviewed your situation and either assessed your own position and gathered supporting evidence, or even better still, obtain a professional review from an IR35 expert. Remember, you need to consider the written terms of your contract and your working practices, and I can't stress enough how important it would be to gather a file of evidence to support your status. Spend some time networking. Identify a named list of other contractors who you could substitute into your contract if you need to. This again will support your IR35 status. If your review reveals not such a strong position, you still have time on your hands to either look for a new role or to tweak the contract terms and working practices to strengthen your position. I do think in many cases your end client is going to want to do everything possible to retain talent and complete projects. So being open and talking to them should mean you can work together to achieve the best result for everyone. If ultimately you find yourself genuinely inside IR35, you can consider alternative options to running your limited company. For most people during the public sector experience, they found an umbrella solution to be the most beneficial, although some found it very helpful to be able to switch between umbrella and limited company as contracts allowed. Any contractors engaged with Orange Genie Accountancy will be able to talk through their options with their accountant on an ongoing basis, as we offer an easy solution to switching between the two. Recruitment agencies need to play their part in preparing as well. It's a good idea for them to be talking to the end clients early. Many of them are. Agencies should make sure they understand what's coming by engaging with a compliance expert. They should open communications with end clients and contractors as soon as possible. They need to be comfortable with the processes that their end clients are going to take, and they should talk to them about the need for reasonable care and proper individual IR35 assessments as opposed to a blanket approach. We'll be promoting further details and follow-up in the weeks to come on how we can help them to prepare and support clients and contractors. Agencies are best advised to encourage their contractors to determine their IR35 status now, as I've already said. Where contractors do seek external professional advice, they are much more likely to be compliant, and this evidence can be used to assist you and the end clients if questioned later by the revenue. As a contractor, you'd probably be forgiven for thinking the budget was only about IR35, because it doesn't take long on LinkedIn or any of the social media sites to see that that's the main topic of the day. But there was a bit more to it, and I'll summarise some of the key areas for you now. As you'd expect, the Chancellor also announced annual changes to tax thresholds and allowances. The simple table on the slide shows you those changes over recent years. The government were able to yesterday announced an increase in the personal allowance to £12,500 from April 19, which is a year ahead of their manifesto pledge. At the same time, the Chancellor has also confirmed that future increases in personal allowance will now be in line with inflation, following them arriving at the place they said they would be by 2021. The main points to note then are that there was a higher than expected increase in personal allowance. Some people even thought it would be frozen. So in reality, this is good news because it's more tax-free pay for everyone. The basic rate tax band also increased by more than was expected to £37,500, meaning higher rate tax now only kicks in for incomes over £50,000 from April 2019. There were no announced changes to the additional rate of tax for those earning £150,000 per annum. The tax-free dividend allowance remains at £2,000 in 2019-2020. Whilst I appreciate this isn't a lot of money, we probably should be quite relieved. This was highly predicted to be something that the Chancellor was going to remove, so I think it's good news that it's still there. Corporation tax rates remain at 19%, and the government are still committed to reducing that to 17% by 2021. The tax-free capital gains tax allowance for individuals will increase to £12,000 for 2019-20. As usual, we also saw the Chancellor announce the annual increases in the national living and minimum wages for all age groups. The national living wage for those over 25 is rising to £8.21 from £7.83. And you can see on the screen that there are similar increases for all age groups across the minimum wage brackets. VAT was mentioned briefly by the Chancellor. Despite much representation that the VAT threshold should be amended to avoid a cliff edge effect of registration at the compulsory limit of £85,000, Philip Hammond confirmed that there are difficulties in amending the VAT rules in the UK due to them being very entwined in EU law. Making any changes to VAT registration limits will require consultation and clarity on our position post-Brexit. So for now, what the Chancellor did confirm yesterday was that for the next 2 years at least, the rules will not change and the compulsory VAT registration limit will remain at £85,000. Turning to some other tax reliefs that affect contractors. As had been rumoured, the Chancellor did announce some changes to the rules on entrepreneurs relief. Whilst it hasn't been scrapped as some predicted, there has been a change to the application. Over recent years, many contractors have benefited from a reduced tax rate of 10% when closing their companies down. But there has been some evidence that the system has been open to abuse, with many people closing companies to obtain a tax advantage before restarting a new company only to repeat the process. In order to support longer-term business investments and true entrepreneurs, from April 2019, The minimum qualifying period for relief to apply will be extended from 12 months to 24 months. That means that you must have owned the company and traded for a minimum of 24 months before entrepreneurs' relief can be claimed. In addition, shareholders must also be entitled to 5% of the distributable profits and net assets of the company, as well as owning 5% of the share capital and voting rights. For most contractors, this will be one and the same thing. The measure will discourage the use of limited companies for short periods of time where the intention is purely to withdraw funds at a tax advantage, but shouldn't disadvantage those of you that are genuinely building up capital reserves in your company for your future. Current rules allow for a £3,000 employment allowance relief against your national insurance bill. Change to the employment allowance for national insurance was announced, and from April 2020, the government will restrict access to employers with an employer's national insurance contribution bill below £100,000. This is unlikely to affect the majority of contractors' claims, as your employer's national insurance bill is normally well below this threshold, so you can continue to take this relief. Turning to capital gains tax, it's always been the case that no capital gains tax should be payable on the sale of your main home. However, current capital gains tax rules have allowed some principal private residence relief to be claimed where the homeowner has not lived in the property for some time and let it out. To better target private residence relief at owner-occupiers, from April 2020, the government have reformed the lettings relief and are going to consult on changes. They're suggesting that lettings relief should only apply in circumstances where the owner of the property has at some point lived in the address. It is at the moment possible to claim principal private residence relief even if you've never lived there. And the final period of exemption for lettings relief will be reduced from 18 months to 9 months. There won't be any changes to the 36 months final period exemption that is currently available for those who have to move into a care home. So today we've highlighted the key areas of the budget to affect contractors as we see them. We'll be following up this webinar by sending out the slides and supporting material in the form of a Q&A guide, as well as some advice on perhaps how best to demonstrate your outside IR35 position as we all prepare for April 2020. Over the coming weeks and months, we'll publish more information and analysis as we digest and understand the published legislation. But for now, does anybody have any questions?
Thanks, Helen. There's a couple of questions that have been written from the audience, so I'm going to read them out and Helen will answer them. In the meantime, feel free to ask more. We will publish the questions and the answers as well in the coming days. The first question is, what factors do you think that large and medium-sized companies will take in determining whether a contractor is inside or outside of IR35?
Well, the legislation will require the end client to take what's known as reasonable care, and it will also require them to look at both the written terms of the contract and the working practices. So in other words, the day-to-day reality of what's happening between the relationship between the contractor and the end client. So all those factors will need to be taken into account. What's known as a working practices questionnaire may well be completed. It will look at the idea of control, whether the contractor is being managed, how they operate, where they work, whether they use their own equipment, whether they have insurance, all those kind of factors that indicate that you're in business on your own account as opposed to, being an employee. Control will be the big one, I think. There'll be a lot of focus on the actual relationship and how the work's undertaken. We've got some material already prepared looking at what that might look like and what evidence can be gathered, so we can certainly share that with you as part of the Q&As to add a bit more detail.
Thank you, Helen. The next question is, so other than the standard IR35 reviews, what else needs to be done to ensure that post 2020 you are not within IR35?
Other than doing what's always been best practice, really, and making sure that, as I've just said, both your written contract terms and your working practices indicate that you're outside of IR35, that you're not undertaking a business as usual role for that end client. There is nothing much else that you can do at this stage, really. Talk to the end client, talk to the agency, make sure you're all on the same page, that you understand, perhaps get a written confirmation of arrangement statement from the end client confirming your view of your position. That would certainly strengthen your position.
I think as a subsidiary part to that question, someone asks, what do you think that it would be useful to put in an evidence file? Which
Okay, so we're talking right from the very beginning there, just demonstrating that you're operating your own business and that you're behaving differently to an employee. So when you're engaging with end clients or agencies looking for work, if you're having to spend time travelling, putting together proposals, gather the evidence of those where you win work, where you lose work, where perhaps you've incurred costs and then nothing materialises. Examples of the day-to-day behaviour, so letting your end client politely know that you're working from home, that you're not coming in that particular day, rather than requesting and asking, certainly not using any kind of holiday request form or anything like that. Evidence that you've had to take risk, that you've got your insurance policies, that if anything's perhaps gone wrong, you've had to put work in at your own expense to put things right. Again, we can send out, we've got a guide very nearly ready to give you more detail on that, so we can certainly send that out post-webinar.
If the company, sorry, as I'm trying to read the questions out, there's more and more coming in, which is excellent news, but I'm missing the one that I was just about to read out, beg your pardon. How likely do you think that end clients will de-risk by just moving contractor work to consultancies? Although the rates are higher than contractors, clients could feel that this is a price worth paying.
I think that's very likely, in all honesty. We'll have to see what the reaction is, but that's certainly a possibility. Yeah.
A question I suspect a lot of people are asking at this stage is, if the company I work for deem me to be inside IR35, do I really need a limited company anymore?
The experience from the public sector was certainly that if you're going to be deemed inside IR35, you are in effect paying employment taxes and not gaining any of the benefit of employment rights. So a lot of people took the view that they were better off going into an umbrella company, because they were then getting full employment rights and continuous employment, and I think the same will possibly happen in the private sector.
Will clients pass off the IR35 assessment work to the recruitment agency instead of doing it themselves? And could clients and or agencies require contractors to take out a form of IR35 insurance to pay out in the event of an incorrect assessment?
Clients may well want to pass on the assessment work to recruitment agencies. Whether the recruitment agencies are likely to want to accept it or not is another matter, because as the fee payer, they are going to be responsible for any taxes that aren't correctly calculated and aren't paid. I think the answer to that is they're going to have to collaborate, they're going to have to work together. It's the only way this is going to work for the end clients to retain the contractors they need and the skills they need, and the agencies to be able to place. They're going to have to work together on this one. Could they be required to contractors take out a form of insurance to pay out in the event of an incorrect assessment? That's possibly a decision that they may take. I would be very wary about certain insurance policies. I've seen in the past IR35 protection policies not pay out for all sorts of various reasons. So I think best advice is to get proper expert compliance and IR35 assessments done in the first place.
A lot of companies insist that contractors use the company's / the client's equipment and not connect their own equipment to the client's network for security reasons. What's HMRC's view on this?
Okay, a very sensible approach normally, which might sound unusual when I'm talking about HMRC. I think we have to remember that IR35, the assessment of it, is a very holistic approach, and the fact that you are required to use somebody's equipment may well isn't enough in itself to find you inside IR35. For security reasons and also, all sorts of other things, if you have to be on site, if you're working at a bank and you've got to use their mainframe computer, that isn't enough. So we need to look at the whole relationship, really. If you're using their equipment for security reasons, but you're still there working autonomously with a project to be completed without any direction and supervision, you're still going to be likely to be found outside IR35. So in itself, that provision of equipment won't be enough without looking at the rest of the circumstances.
Thank you. Do you see a significant risk of a change in status from outside to in of an ongoing contract post 2020 providing a basis for HMRC to target the historical status of that contractor?
There is a risk, obviously. However, a document published by HMR Treasury last night clearly states that the revenue are not interested in retrospective historical cases, that they are more focused on efforts of ensuring businesses comply going forward, and they won't be carrying out targeted campaigns into previous years. I have to say I treat that with some scepticism because we know how the revenue have operated in the past, but at the moment their delivery is they will not do that.
How do you think IR35 will affect companies with 2 directors taking a salary, especially when one director has another job? Very specific question there.
IR35 needs to be looked at on the basis of a contract by contract basis. So the fact you've got 2 directors, each director will need to look at their own individual contract. They will need to determine if that's outside IR35 or not. If one's outside and one's inside, it'll give people like ourselves a bit of a headache working out the maths and doing the payroll for you. But it's possible for that to happen. So we'll just have to work around it the same as we do now with 2 director companies where somebody can be inside and somebody can be outside.
Okay. The HMRC IR35 tool doesn't make any reference to mutuality of obligation. Is that failing, or
I would
it no longer
absolutely say that this is a failing. Only a couple of weeks ago, there was a case where a judge absolutely highlighted the lack of mutuality and that the tool that you're referring to didn't provide the right answer in his opinion when looking at the status of a contractor. So no, this is a failing. Again, in the same document I've just previously referred to, the Treasury do acknowledge that improvements to that tool are needed, and certainly that's something we will be encouraging and spending the next 18 months lobbying that if that's to be used, it needs to be improved.
Thank you, Helen. There's still lots of questions coming in. Don't forget, we will write responses to all these questions with what we send out to everybody at the end. But I'll ask a couple more before we finish. As the end client determines the status, is there a possibility to challenge the decision, the possibility that the contractor can challenge that decision?
Sadly, if the rules apply in the same way as they have done in the public sector, there is no formal challenge process, there's no formal appeal process. What we have to hope for is that through lots of communication, early collaboration and working together, we can get to the right decision and the right IR35 status position before we get to the point that somebody needs to challenge it. But as it stands, subject to what the consultation next year brings, there's no right of appeal.
And a final question, unless any more come in whilst we're reading it out, is if more contractors are forced to use umbrella solutions as a result of inside IR35 assessments, do you think this will increase or decrease day rates? I can answer that from our experiences with the public sector last year. It depends a lot on the client, and it depends a lot on the value of you to them. But historically, there were increases to day rates, given that what people were trying to do was offset the increased deductions, if you like, in terms of the deemed salary taxes and so forth. So typically, rates went up by as much as 20 to 25% in some cases, and there's no reason why the response will be any different, I don't think.
Okay, so that seems to be all the questions for today. If you do have any more, please don't hesitate to get in contact with us. We're happy to help. In the meantime, I'd just like to thank you for listening and wish you a pleasant evening.